Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I'm Nathan Slomke. I'll be presenting the analysis I've conducted on the Orlando Magic free agency recommendation using machine learning. Some background on this case is, Terrence Ross has had a 3-year contract with the Orlando Magic. It will expire within a few hours. And before we release him to free agency, we need to see if we should re-sign him or go with another strong contender, Rudy Gay. And so we need to compare their metrics using machine learning and make a decision from there. Analytics in the NBA has become more and more of a common tool to make free agency decisions, coaching strategies, as well as finding new insights for management to make decisions on. And so it's becoming more and more commonplace. You had some early adopters with the Rockets and the 76ers, but virtually everyone is using it now. There have always been a lot of stats with basketball in the NBA, and this has, for the large part, been descriptive statistics like field goal percentage, points per game, rebounds, steals, things like that. As the NBA has progressed through the years, it has also come with it more advanced statistics that it tries to gather to make more powerful decisions. And so one of those is the player impact estimate. This is the overall statistical contribution for all events occurring within the game that that player had if they played in that game. And so it's a way to measure their impact in that game, and anything over 10% is considered excellent. There's also win shares adjusted plus minus in PER as far as some other advanced statistics. And no metric is perfect. It's all, numbers and calculations, and so it's important to take them within combination of one another to make more informed decisions. In order to assess Terrence Ross and Rudy Gay, we need to first create a baseline model for our machine learning, and this will be done by using 6 NBA players that we have a well-recognized player profile within the league, whether it's good, medium, or bad. So the top 2 you see here are excellent, legendary players. The middle 2 are middle of the pack, and the last 2 are lower tier performing players. And so knowing this, we can use their statistics over a 3-year, 3 seasons data, and all sorts of statistics will be included in this model for each game that they were in. And from that, we can, the target variable will be PEIE, and from this we can go ahead and use our model to make predictions about Terrence Ross and Rudy Gay in the future. Many models were compared to each other for machine learning, and so multiple regression was the one that won out, but we also compared that to random forest, gradient boosting, and regression tree. And it's my belief that this won out because its ability to isolate different variables and see which one has the biggest impact on results. This is really useful when you have large amounts of data, as we do, and actually this one factors in interactions that occur. So things that happen, in tandem with each other are taken into account. And something like regression tree with a large data set with this many variables can be problematic, as it forms a lot of if-then statements that are really conditional on what the original decisions it decided to make were, and so it can kind of get locked into that. So multiple regression won out in this case, and I'll get into the discussion on that in the technical section. This is a snapshot of our model. I'll get into it in the technical section, like I said, but highlighted in red, you can see where we're actually beginning to score the data for Rudy and Terrence's data sets and make predictions. Rudy Gay's management team was gracious to give us his projections for the upcoming season, so you can see them here, and I will summarize them in future slides. Our model predicted a PIE value for him for 12.3. This is a graph we use. It shows us how accurate our data set was against the model. And you can see there's a lot of ebbs and flows. Unfortunately, the error rate was higher than I'd like to see, but all in all, it does follow the trend of the training data. I think part of the reason too for the variation is that we only have 6 players in this model, in the model we've built, and so yeah, the NBA is huge and there's a lot of different player styles and not everything's going to fit perfectly. So if we could feed more than 6 players in the future, that would trim down this variability. Here's other considerations for Rudy Gay, but we'll summarize that up here in a future slide. Terrence Ross, his management team's projections that they gave us can be seen here. Again, we will show these side by side with Rudy Gay in an upcoming slide. His PIE was lower, 8.36. He had a more accurate model, as you see here. Here's our side-by-side comparison comparing Rudy Gay and Terrence Ross. Our PIE value for Rudy Gay was 12.3 compared to 8.36 for Terrence, and so he wins out in that category, which is the primary analysis that we've conducted. But you do see the projections that are provided. He is higher as well compared to Terrence. His salary is lower. One thing to note is his age is a bit higher by 4 years, so consider that for long-term ramifications. He may not last as long, but ultimately it's because of these metrics and the PIE score that we recommend Rudy Gay. So releasing Terrence Ross to some of these teams that have expressed interest and picking up Rudy Gay in the free agency. That was it for the management side of things, so I'm going to go into the technical aspects of how the model was built if you're still interested in seeing that. So first off, in building our model, it's important to have the right assumptions, and so the information we're given about Tony Snell was that he was actually a good contributor and a middle of the road performer on teams, but as we've looked at him and creating this chart, he's really, in my opinion, one of the bottom tier players, and so we're going to categorize him according to that for the model. You can see our additional analysis outlined in this black square. These are the percentage of when they've had the worst metric, the bottom third metrics per category. So again, Tony Snell, if you look at him, he has high rates for each of those. Also PER, that's similar to PIE value, but PER is another total player impact type of advanced statistic, and so he scores quite low in that as well, so it's our recommendation to score him lower in the model. We've also characterized things like this in graphical form. I won't go into all the detail, but it's similar to what you saw in that table, but it's in the form of graphs. Here you can see field goal percentage and points. Like the graph before in the previous slide, they follow similar distributions as the table in the player rankings. Lastly, this graph shows more defensive metrics like steals, blocks. You see a little more variation with this as some of the top performing offensive ones like LeBron James don't perform as well in defensive. I did think it was important to point this out. This is the amount of games started per player, and so this will actually influence some of the metrics and how they're calculated for averages, because if they have less games they've played, their averages could be inflated. So it's important to note this because Mario, he actually played only over 50 games, but he has a higher PIE score than Tony and Maurice, and so it's important to see how games started could influence that scoring. This is a graph from our actual model that compares the actual PIE versus the predicted PIE. So you see it follows pretty closely on each category in green versus yellow, You see some variation with some of the middle players there, but all in all, pretty good. Here's the snapshot of the pipeline we ran for this model. So you can see a lot went on with managing different levels of variables to doing transformations on measurement data and then imputing for the regression models, which is ultimately what we went with. We toyed with a lot of the inputs going in with leaf counts and depth and combination metrics, stepwise, forward-looking, things like that. Gradient boosting, we also adjusted different metrics, but yep, ultimately it was the multiple regression that won out for the reasons I listed during the management section. So here's our model, the multiple regression. It had interactions included in it. It was stepwise, and it had 25% to enter the model and 25% to stay in the model was what won out. It had 13 input variables that came into the model, so quite a bit. So the parameter estimates for the input variables from the previous slide are seen here, and highlighted in yellow are some of the more impactful ones. You see some of them are negative, and that's because it's the inverse of them, and then the others are because they're actually negatively associated with the PIE value, like turnovers and personal fouls. And then the field goal percentage was highly, had a big impact in affecting the PIE score. So to interpret some of these, it would be to say if you control only for field goal percentage, for example, how much would that influence PIE score if everything else was held constant? It would influence it 11.5 times. This is the predicted mean against actual, and I've put each player on here on where they fall on the line. You want to see this line superimposed on top of each other would be perfect, but that's pretty hard to get in the real world. You see some underfitting, some overfitting, but in solid you see the predicted and dotted is the target. And really it follows pretty well until the last probably 20% in the depth chart is where it really starts to get off a little bit. This is a similar graph where the means are actually plotted against each other. So if it was perfect, it would be a slope of 1. But yeah, where it's under the curve or under the trend, it would be an underfit, and over would be an overfit. So you see for the validation in gold, it tends to overfit the data somewhat. So I did want to talk about this issue. Average square error between training and validation data had a pretty large divergence from each other. We should see them, equivalent would be ideal. And so, yeah, that's concerning. I have reasons why that could be, but it's best to go back and check your distributions on all your input variables, as well as your target variables and the averages respective to each. So you see almost all of these look perfect. The distributions look really similar. Also, the averages are all almost equivalent except for minutes played. These are the remaining input variables of those 13 that we had. You do see a little more variation in this group, and I will say these are trending downwards down the p-value scale. So the ones that you saw on the previous slide were higher up on that scale. These are further down, so we should expect to see more variation in these. And looks like total rebounds, the distribution was a little off there, and then game started was a p-value of 21, so it barely fit into our model. It didn't even have parameter estimates for that one. And then the averages, you see a little more variation in that too. I don't think that this would have caused the large discrepancy that we have in the training and validation. It's important to note that each model that I compared had this issue, so it wasn't just with the regression models. It was all of them, gradient boosting, any of them had that. And so looking at this and the averages, I think it could be because there were only 6 player profiles within the model, so that's quite a bit of variation that could come with it, and not every player is going to fit perfectly within that. So I think we need more data points to have a more accurate model.